Welcome to the LearnSkin podcast with Dr. Raja and Dr. Hadar, where they discuss all things skin. Skin is fascinating because it affects us in so many ways, like our health, psychology, and how we connect with those around us. This podcast delves into the art and science of skincare. A short disclaimer before we get to the good stuff. Dr. Raja Sivamani and Dr. Hadar Lev-Tov are board-certified dermatologists. This podcast is meant for educational and informational purposes only. All opinions shared do not express the views of LearnSkin. Neither this podcast nor any information contained within it are a substitute for professional care by a doctor or other qualified medical professional. This podcast does not constitute medical or other professional advice or services. If you have a medical concern, please consult with your physician.
My name is Hadar Lev-Tov, and today your guys are in for a special treat, and I'm in for that same treat. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce our guest today. This is a really special honor to have Dr. Aric Prather here with us today. He is an associate professor at UCSF and has done a lot of training in some forsaken institutions like UCSF, Berkeley, and other places, and has multiple awards, including NIH grants, and is a co-director of the Aging, Metabolism, and Emotions Research Center at UCSF. Hi, Aric. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes, and I should say that your area of interest, your focus is on sleep, which is a huge area that interests everybody who's interested in wellness and integrative approaches to health. We spend a good amount of our day doing that activity, and people sometimes forget that it's part of the health. So if you want to treat the whole person, you should certainly consider that time of day, and something that we all have in common as humans. So let's jump right into it. I wanted to ask you first, if you can tell us a little bit, what is it that you actually do in your clinical practice and also a little bit in the research arena?
Yeah, absolutely. So, right. So I'm at UCSF and I, spend most of my time doing research, basic research, translational research, but I also, have a passion for treating sleep problems. And so a couple of years ago, we established an insomnia clinic. It was the first time that UCSF had an insomnia clinic, or a clinic specifically for treating that. And so I see people who have sleep problems, and oftentimes they've been dealing with them for a really long time. They've been taking lots of different medications that don't seem to be effective, or their prescriber is trying to get them off of those medications like Ambien or benzodiazepines like Xanax or Ativan. And, there's the first line treatment for treating insomnia specifically is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that's kind of agreed upon by the American College of Physicians, but yet it's very rare for someone to get that as their first line treatment, in part because there's just not a lot of providers, and it's much easier to write a script for that. But it's been shown to be incredibly effective, as effective, if not more, than sleep medications in the short term. But then in the long term, it's much more effective because you're kind of given the tools to deal with kind of future insomnia, and it doesn't carry any of the risks. And so it's been yeah. And
it sounds like everything in the integrative realm, when you try to change behavior, it's hard work up front, but then the results carry forward and often dividends. So it sounds like that's the story here.
Yeah, I mean, and sleep is a little unique that way, that there, many of that behaviors that we try to change, people have to give up something that they like to get there, right? So like, if you're trying to lose weight, you have to give up the pizza, you have to give up kind of all the salty, sweet snacks. Or if you in the same, if you want to exercise, you have to, make time for that and kind of
it hurts.
And it hurts, right? I mean, I hate sweating, honestly. And it's just, but sleep is one of these things that, no one would dispute that they want to do more of it. There is kind of a cultural problem around kind of the badge of honor of not sleeping. And that's something that we really fight up against. And that's a lot of the reason why I do the research that I do, despite the fact that oftentimes people say, well, didn't we already know that about sleep? Like, didn't we know that if you didn't get enough sleep, bad things happen? But it turns out that it takes that kind of empirical evidence to begin to shift the conversation. But sleep is one of those things that kind of people enjoy doing, and it really, one of the things that's I find is so interesting is kind of what it means for someone's day. Right. So, it's not just about the importance of sleep, and it does have this richness and power for your immune system, for your cognition when you do sleep, but it also kind of improves kind of your day-to-day kind of when you're awake. When people get their sleep back, they really tend to see things, in a better light, right? Like right. Hassles don't bother them as much. They're not as angry. They have better relationships with their partners, all of those kind of things. And so it's really win-win both on the sleep side, but also kind of in the daytime functioning.
Right. And I think that's a perfect segue to talk, because you mentioned, everybody thinks, okay, so yeah, sleep is good. But when we talk about health specifically, maybe you can give us, at least in broad strokes, what are the specific areas of health, specific disease that can be modified, or there's good evidence to show that the disease is modified by good sleep, or that poor sleep hurts?
Sure. So there's kind of the acute costs of sleep loss. So those are kind of like cognitive, like accidents. I mean, we get tons of more accidents as a consequence of the days after kind of daylight savings, for instance. Right. But then there's the long-term costs. And so, there is, fairly good evidence, largely coming from epidemiologic studies that show that, people that are short sleepers, say like getting less than 6 hours a night for a long period of time, are at increased risk for early death from all causes. But, in particular, there's strong evidence for cardiovascular disease. There's good evidence for kind of intermediate markers like hypertension and type 2 diabetes, a whole bunch of metabolic conditions. There's work that we've done looking at susceptibility to infectious illness. And then there's kind of growing alarming evidence that sleep is related to the increased incidence and progression of neurodegenerative diseases. And so certainly that's one that gets a lot of attention now, but we're learning more and more about the unique role of sleep in actually kind of clearing, things like, amyloid out of the brain across the night and all of those things. And it seems like sleep plays this fundamental role in how well the brain works efficiently. And so, any disease that you look at, physical health, there's a sleep component. And that's not to say that it's also not related to tons of mental health disorders. Of course, sleep is an important predictor of, say, the onset of depression, for instance.
Right. That's so fascinating. And I think we find that there's effect on cardiovascular disease, for example, with it's at least in the field of dermatology, the big studies on psoriasis, and showing that, people with large plaque psoriasis have really strong signal of effect on cardiovascular events. And that's been shown again and again. So, and it may be the connection is around inflammation. But before I get to the sleep and inflammation story, I do want to ask you, because patients ask me a lot when I tell them, you need to get some good night's sleep. What is the right amount of sleep that a person should get? Because you mentioned, and I see this repeatedly in your papers, that 6 hours is sort of the cutoff. But is it really 6 hours? What do you tell your patients, and what should we maybe think about as the good amount of time to sleep?
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, this is a really important question. So, the guidelines from the American Academy of Sleep Medicine and the Sleep Research Society is for people to get at least 7 hours of sleep to maintain optimal adult health. And so, but it's always been somewhere between 7 and 9 hours seems to be the place that we want to shoot for. Certainly one thing that we don't do well in sleep research is kind of assessing sleep needs. So it's likely that people need this kind of like 7 to 9, but there's people, it's a distribution. And so some people need less, some people need more. And so we always have to be careful about, a specific number that someone tries to shoot for in the case that it may cause like anxiety for them if they aren't able to achieve that. But that being said, there are lots of people that say, oh, I know that's how much most people need, but I only need 4 or 5 hours. I only need 6 hours. And by and large, those people are wrong. They think that, but often, it's kind of the decrements that people experience are often imperceptible to them. But if we bring them into the laboratory, we see, lapses in concentration, slowing of reaction time, and that type of sleep kind of builds up, that debt builds up and can have a cost in the long term. And so, we try to shoot for the 7 to 9 thing, but, everyone's a little bit different, but it's more likely that you're kind of in the middle there.
And you mentioned that there's a gap in kind of understanding the specific need, but is there a rule of thumb that a person can use if they want to, say, experiment over the next few weeks and say, okay, this week I'll try 4 hours and see how I'm doing, or 7 hours and see how I'm doing? What's a good rule of thumb, if there is such a thing, to say, okay, I think that was good sleep?
Yeah, I mean, we think about like how much sleep. So when you go on vacation, for instance, and you're unconstrained by work, that is a good way to experience what good sleep is, right? And so when you wake up on your own, when you feel rested, usually what happens when people go on vacation, they actually sleep a lot longer in the beginning because there's so much debt that is accrued, right? And I think an important thing to note is that though you can kind of make up some of that lost sleep, we don't think that you can make up all the sleep debt that you accrue. So it's not something like the bank, right? Like you can't pay it off and take it back at any time. Your body knows, and there's a cost for that. And we're trying to learn more about that. But I think, if someone wanted to find out kind of what their sleep need was, that would be one way to do it in kind of an unconstrained environment, letting them fall asleep and stay asleep until they wake up naturally. Obviously, we don't often have that luxury. I mean, I would veer away from the idea of experimenting with shortening people's sleep to see how bad it gets, right? I mean, we certainly don't want to put people in danger. Certainly car accidents happen all the time because of this type of thing. But you can certainly try to kind of figure out, give yourself a sleep vacation and see kind of what feels best for you.
All right. I think you make a great case. I think I'm going to appeal to my boss that I need that sleep vacation to improve my performance.
Yeah. Makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's good. And that's really useful advice, I think, because trying to think of how to answer our patients and speak intelligently about this topic that we frankly don't learn much about, not in medical school and certainly not in residency.
Well, I think one, you should be commended, and anybody else who does that, to actually ask about sleep. That's like the first step. Oftentimes, people don't even ask about it or assess it in any kind of clear way. And I think then the next thing is, if you do identify people that have actual kind of true severe sleep complaints, like what to do with them, like what are the resources to provide them? Certainly the two things that we worry most about is insomnia and, say, obstructive sleep apnea, both of which, carry significant biological costs with respect to cardiovascular disease, those types of things. And so, I think, ensuring that you have resources for a sleep disorder center where they can get assessed in the case if they have obstructive sleep apnea, or, a provider that can get them to cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia is really important for any practice, to know where those resources are. And, certainly there are societies that, like the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, again, and the Sleep Research Society, that, have a list of these things in different regions so that people have the resources they need.
Yeah, those are very important tips to have in mind. And perhaps later we'll make sure that we post this on the Facebook Live session so people can access those resources. Thank you. That's very good. So we alluded before to the connection to sleep and inflammation. And I want to touch about that because, at least to me, from my narrow understanding of sleep, that's a significant area where we connect to skin disease. Certainly there's a lot of inflammatory skin disease, and I feel like that's a good area where there's emerging evidence, some of it thanks to your work. So maybe we can focus about the effect, tell us a little bit about the effect of sleep on inflammation, and maybe even some specific markers that have been identified.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, at the broadest level, sleep is intimately tied to the immune system, right? And so, both the acquired immune system and the innate immune system, and kind of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, these inflammatory markers, are certainly part of that story and communicating within the immune system and creating havoc in some cases in the context of disease. And so, there's now kind of just a really large body of evidence that suggests that kind of people who are habitually poor sleepers, so they have this short sleep duration, or their sleep is just fragmented, or they report really poor sleep quality, those people tend to have higher levels of these markers of inflammation. So these are things like interleukin-6 or tumor necrosis factor alpha, or even acute phase proteins that we look at more clinically in lots of settings, like C-reactive protein. These things seem to be elevated in these poor sleepers. And, some of the strongest evidence has come from experimental studies. So where they bring people into the laboratory and they, either deprive them of a whole night of sleep, or even just a partial night of sleep where then someone, instead of getting 8 hours, they only get 4 hours, and then they measure their levels the next morning compared to a control condition, and they find that, those proteins are often elevated just after that short period of time. And then, when they look at the genome, they also see kind of increased upregulation of a lot of these inflammatory pathways. And so, somehow this lack of sleep is kind of getting under the skin and activating these pathways. And there may be an adaptive part to this, right? So if someone is kind of faced with an injury, evolutionarily, they might have to deprive themselves of sleep. And so our body kind of upregulates pathways that might be important, but in lacking that context, and if there's other things involved, say you already have a skin disease that is marked by elevated levels of inflammation or inflammatory pathways, that having poor sleep on top of that can possibly, create, a more severe presentation or require additional treatment that it otherwise wouldn't had your sleep been better regulated.
Right. And I think as you're talking about this, and kind of a little bit from our conversation before where we went on live, I'm thinking, at least in dermatology and certainly in other areas, we are getting a lot of new medications, and some of them very powerful. And yet we see people who don't respond, and I often think about why they don't respond, and perhaps these are some of the confounders to the success. And sleep can be one of them. I mean, people think about biologics and antibodies, but I think talking to patients about sleep can certainly open the light to, okay, something was working before and it's not working anymore. And patients may say, I'm under a lot of stress, and kind of breaking it down and trying to realize what it is. I think I wouldn't be surprised if you find sleep as a major contributor to this. So treatment success could be dependent on that.
Yeah. I mean, this is how I kind of got into this work altogether. Was my background was in stress and how it affected the immune system. And what was so interesting to me when I was kind of reading the literature, and I got I worked with someone who did a lot of sleep work, that was that a lot of the outcomes that we were interested in the stress world, you saw the very same outcomes when you deprive people of sleep. And it was no surprise that like stress and sleep are so intimately tied. And so, one of the goals of the work that I've been doing is really to not look at those things as separate phenomena, but kind of account for someone's 24-hour day and look at where kind of there may be interactions that, for individuals where poor sleep actually produces more stress. And so who are resilient, kind of what levers are there to help kind of break that cycle, and what does it mean for kind of individuals' immune function and immune related conditions?
Yeah, this is certainly fascinating, and I'm sure there's much more to be learned. And I'm going to take this break here to remind people that this program is brought to you by LearnSkin.com, which is a trusted source for high quality evidence-based education that tries to bring conventional and complementary medical approaches. Courses are taught by leading experts in dermatology and other areas in integrative medicine, and you can become a member now and begin earning your CME credits on our mobile-friendly platform. It's ready on demand whenever you need it and where you need it, and do this simply by going to LearnSkin.com. That will also offer you some exclusive offers. For example, our annual Integrative Dermatology Symposium, where Dr. Prather will be speaking a little more about the stress side of his work and its effect on inflammation and skin disease. So you can find a lot more information about that at LearnSkin.com. So I'm going to go back and really focus the inflammation story now on one disease entity in skin that I think you've done some work in, and I think there's growing evidence about sleep, and that's atopic dermatitis. And I'd like to start that with a story. A patient I was talking to, and she's probably in her 70s, and had atopic eczema or atopic dermatitis her entire life. And she was started on a strong medication on dupilumab. And when we talked to her about, she improved. And when we asked her, how is she doing on the medication after a few weeks, the first thing she said that she realized after 70 years on this planet, what's a good night's sleep. And that story, first of all, made me tear up a little bit looking at this person who's been clearly suffering and the success of the medication. But I think it really showed me the importance of sleep in a person's life. And that's the first thing she said. She did not talk about the itch. She did not talk about rash, the appearance of the skin to other people, That was the first thing that she said. And atopic eczema is such a multifaceted disease. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that you've done in this area in collaboration with other people. And I think you've done some really large studies looking at the effect on the interaction between sleep and atopic dermatitis. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the research you've done and the findings you have?
Yeah. I mean, I was really fortunate to kind of team up with some really impressive dermatologists to look at kind of this large cohort study from the UK, where they were able to collect data over a long period of time, both in children with atopic dermatitis and then the mothers of the children who didn't have atopic dermatitis, to look at kind of how much sleep seemed to matter to play a role in kind of characterizing folks with atopic dermatitis against those who do not. And I don't think the findings themselves are not particularly surprising, in that kind of children who have atopic dermatitis, they report more sleep disturbances than those who do not. But what was interesting in this case was that even children that had inactive atopic dermatitis reported more sleep disturbances than those who didn't. That it was, obviously severity mattered, but there was something else going on that kind of distinguished these children with atopic dermatitis from those who didn't. And I mean, I think this epidemiologic study can't figure that out, but I think there's like a lot of interesting mechanistic work that could be done in these types of cohorts. And then within the mothers, we found that if they had a child with atopic dermatitis, they were about 50% more likely to report having sleep disturbances than those who didn't. And, again, it was a situation where the mothers, when they, even in their children that had inactive atopic dermatitis, they still had more sleep problems, and it wasn't accounted for by the children's sleep problems. That it wasn't just that the children are waking up all the time and this is causing problems in the mother's sleep, that that there's potentially there's a psychological nature to having to care for someone that has a skin disease like this, and that it really suggested that providers, when they're treating a patient, should also really think about the caregiver and their health and well-being, because of the toll that this can take on them as well, and certainly impact their ability to care for that patient.
Absolutely. And we always acknowledge eczema as a disease of the family. At least I always think about it as disease of the family. One of my teachers here in Miami always has a great slide that shows a baby crying, and it says, if I'm not sleeping, nobody's sleeping. So I think it's a great illustration of this, and this kind of puts the numbers behind it. So I wanted to drill in, because to me what was fascinating is that the hours of sleep, both for the parents and the kids, the hours are the same. So they seem to, whatever the schedule is, they go to sleep at 10, wake up at 6, and it seems like life kind of goes on. If you don't really think about it, you don't pay attention to it. And yet it was the quality of the sleep that was different. And so kind of to the naked eye, people who are not savvy about sleep, it may seem like, okay, there's no problem there. And goes back to the point of you have to kind of scratch the surface a little bit and ask about it. So speaking of that and kind of considering those findings, which, by the way, to the listeners are beautifully articulated at the Journal of the American Academy, the Journal of the American Medical Association, those clinicians who see families like that, what kind of tips we can give them to say, okay, I know that you went to sleep and I know that you think you got a full night's sleep, but how can they improve the quality of the sleep?
Well, I mean, that is certainly challenging. I mean, I think because of the nature of this data, it's hard to know exactly, how well sleep was characterized. I mean, certainly there are ways to try and improve quality by increasing the depth of someone's sleep. And so sometimes what happens is, people, they've been really tired and they've had bad night's sleep, and they're like, oh, I'm going to try to go to bed extra early just so that I can make sure that I get the sleep that I need. And that makes a lot of sense in the short term. But what often happens, at least for people who develop kind of, really fragmented sleep and potentially insomnia, is that, your body can only produce a certain amount of sleep, right? Like some people I talk to, they're like, I would love it if I could just sleep 10 hours. I'm like, you're not a teenager anymore. You're not a toddler. And so, your body can only produce so much. So if you give yourself a sleep window that is bigger than you can fill, you're guaranteeing that some of that window is going to be filled with the wakefulness, right? And what we do know is that if we kind of like light coming into the room, or your temperature is too warm, this is something that we see, regionally in areas where there aren't air conditioners available, or Miami in December is very, very warm and uncomfortable in my experience. And so, that type of thing, we know that our people sleep better when it's cooler, right? And so if you can make your environment one that is kind of sleep welcoming, that will ultimately lead to kind of a quicker ability to fall asleep and a better quality of staying asleep. I mean, other things are like, pets can be, it's really hard when we talk about, parents, because, we're kind of, we have an obligation when you have a child that has, say, atopic dermatitis and they're waking up during the night because they're itching. It's hard to, any parent would kind of put a priority on their child typically over their sleep. And in some ways that's the trade-off. And we're kind of built for that, right? Evolutionarily. And so, sleep isn't everything in this way, but certainly there are things that we can do to ensure that when we have the opportunity to sleep well, that we can.
So speaking about that, what is your thought about power naps? People do that, sprinkle it throughout the day, or even like a power nap before sleep. What do we know about power naps?
Well, so we do know that power naps, so these are short naps, say, no longer than 20 minutes, maybe if you bleed into 30 minutes, it can be helpful in increasing alertness, and people are able to do them, and they can be beneficial in those ways. In a healthy person, that isn't a problem. I think it becomes problematic if, one, it impacts your ability to sleep at night, right? So your sleep pressure, the pressure to sleep, kind of builds up across the day. And so taking a power nap, it's kind of zapping it. It's kind of like snacking before dinner, right?
Right.
And so, that can cause kind of more fragmented sleep. In the same way, if you do long naps, that can also not feel good. So what happens if you take a long nap, say more than 30 minutes, it increases the likelihood that you'll dip into kind of that deep sleep. And when you dip into that deep sleep and you try to wake up, that produces something called sleep inertia. And we've all kind of experienced this. This is like when you feel worse when you wake up from a nap than you did before.
Yes, absolutely. I often experience that. Yes.
Yeah. So you got to shorten up the nap and try not to dip into that slow wave sleep. And of interest related to that is that, they're trying to develop these devices so they can track when you go into slow wave sleep and wake you up before that happens. But, so in a healthy person, naps aren't problematic. And in older adults, it's typically not problematic unless it's kind of an indication of something else going on, right? So we know that when people are sick, for instance, or depressed, they often, sleep longer both at night and during the day. And so if that's increasing and there's not a good reason for it, then, that's something that we, tend to think about.
Got it. Well, thank you. That's good. No question that, at least in the case of eczema, if the first thing is try to treat the eczema and then you kind of heal the whole family like that. But I feel like some of the studies showing even when the disease is quiescent, there's certainly some disturbances happening. So these are really great tips to be able to guide a family as they go through the difficult parts, but also the better parts, and how to say, okay, you need to create a good sleep environment for everybody. I think this is extremely useful. Thank you. So I wanted to maybe, just as a teaser, because I would be remiss to have you here on this program and not ask about some of the amazing work that's been done in your group about telomere shortening and stress. And even though I'm opening a whole new topic, but perhaps you can tell us about the connection of sleep, stress, and telomere shortening, which we think is related to aging, and certainly aging is a big part we talk about when we talk about healthy skin.
Sure. So for those that don't know what telomeres are,
Thank you.
are base pairs on the ends of chromosomes that protect the chromosome from fraying and maintains chromosomal stability within the cell. And what happens when cells divide is like when they proliferate, say there's an infection or just kind of general growth, is the telomeres shorten. And luckily we have an enzyme that puts the base pairs back on to maintain the telomere. But ultimately, if there's too much division and the telomeres shorten too much, the cells either go into kind of programmed cell death to kind of clear them out, or they go into apoptosis, where they become, when they become senescent. So these cells have it's called replicative senescence, and those cells become these aged cells that actually pump out more and more kind of oxidative damage and pro-inflammatory mediators. And so, we think it might be one of these sources for inflammation, in fact. But it turns out that not just infections or other kind of biological processes drive telomere shortening. It turns out that psychological and behavioral things have also been linked to this. And so now there's a large body of evidence that shows that kind of people that report more stress in their life, kind of more adversity that they've experienced, stressful life events, serving in a role that is very stressful, such as being a caregiver for a spouse with Alzheimer's, for instance, which we know is a very stressful thing, tend to have shorter telomeres, at least when we look in immune cells. And in the same way, there's kind of accruing evidence that poor sleep, seems to also be associated with shorter telomeres, particularly when that poor sleep is kind of chronic. And then in one study that we did, we found that interaction, that it wasn't just that sleep predicted shorter telomeres, but it was people that had poor sleep and had this high stress. So kind of this 1-2 punch, those were the ones that seemed to have the shorter telomeres. There's been much more work done in the stress area on telomeres and telomere biology, but us sleep researchers were trying to kind of catch up here, and we are still finding these kind of similar outcomes.
Yeah, I think one take-home message here is that stress and sleep often mirror each other and their effect on our health. And certainly we see that, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it affects skin aging as well. We know that oxidative stress certainly is not good for, at the very least, the appearance of skin, not to mention disease. So thank you for giving us this teaser. I couldn't let you go without talking about that a little bit. Certainly Dr. Prather and his group has done much more research on this, so I encourage all of you to certainly look that up. It's a fascinating read. And with that, I'm going to thank Dr. Prather. Thank you so much for taking the time and being with us this evening. I want to thank everybody else who's joining us on this podcast today. You can check out LearnSkin.com for full recaps of this particular program and other programs and live events and exclusive offers that we have for our listeners. And join us again next week when we dive into another skin-related issue with myself or Dr. Subramani, your host of the LearnSkin podcast. Thank you very much, and thank you, Aric, for being with us.
Absolutely. Great being here.
Thank you for tuning in with Dr. Raja and Dr. Hadar. This podcast is brought to you by LearnSkin, leaders in integrative dermatology education. Visit LearnSkin.com/podcast to explore our many programs. Subscribe today and never miss an episode.